Have you ever actually stopped to think about how much it costs for a company to just exist? I mean, we usually think about the obvious stuff, right? Employee salaries, keeping the lights on at the office, buying raw materials. But there is this invisible price tag attached to a company's day-to-day existence that literally dictates everything about its survival. The fundamental truth is, financing is never free. Money itself has a cost. So let's dive into this and uncover exactly what that actually means.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to decode exactly how to practically estimate the overall costs of financing a firm. We are going to strip away all that dense financial jargon and just look at the straightforward logic behind how businesses price their own money. Understanding this is absolutely crucial. It's basically the foundation of investing.
To do this, we're anchoring our entire analysis in Aswath Damodaran's definitive text, Investment Valuation. What makes his framework so incredibly brilliant to unpack is that it treats the super complex world of corporate finance just like a really practical, logical recipe. Think about it. If you want to know what the final dish is worth, you just need to measure the cost of your ingredients.
Section 1. Why financing costs matter.
Okay, so to understand what a business is truly worth, we first have to understand the specific costs of the ingredients used to fund it, right? It's the absolute first step in figuring out if a company is actually creating value or if it's just burning cash behind the scenes. And that brings us to WACC, or the weighted average cost of capital. Think of WACC as the ultimate output of our recipe. It basically represents the combined cost of the different components of financing used by a firm, weighted by how much of each they actually use. Put simply, this is the baseline return a company must collectively make on its investments just to break even. If a company generates, say, a 7% return, but its WACC is 9%, well, it's silently destroying its own value.
Section 2. Unpacking the cost of equity versus debt.
Like we said, every recipe needs ingredients. And for a corporation trying to raise cash, the two main ones are equity and debt. Now, there is a really stark contrast between these two sources of funding. On the equity side, issuing stock, it's way riskier for the investor because there are absolutely zero guarantees. So investors naturally demand a higher expected return. But on the debt side, borrowing money, well, that comes with promised regular cash flows in the form of interest. That makes it a whole lot safer for the lender. Ask yourself, what return would you personally demand for taking on the high risk of buying a volatile, unpredictable stock versus the relatively safe contractual cash flows of just lending money to an established business?
Section 3. Demystifying the cost of debt.
Because debt is such a wildly powerful tool for a business, how do we actually, practically calculate its cost? Well, generally speaking, it's determined by the current market rate at which the firm can borrow funds today. Not what they borrowed at 10 years ago, but today. The source text gives us this really elegant three-part process for estimating this cost. Step 1, you estimate the firm's total dollar debt and interest expenses. Step 2, you compute a default risk rating based on those numbers, kind of like a corporate credit score. And Step 3, you add a default spread, which is dictated by that rating, to the risk-free rate. So, just as an example, if the government borrows at 4.5% and your company's risk adds an extra 0.75%, your pre-tax cost of debt is simply 5.25%. Pretty straightforward, right?
But here is where things get super interesting. It's almost a little ironic, actually, when we look at corporate finance. The text uses a 35% standard corporate tax rate in some of its examples to highlight a crazy reality. A company's debt is actually cheaper than its stated interest rate. Why? Because the government effectively subsidizes it through a corporate tax shield. Since interest payments are tax-deductible, you multiply your pre-tax cost of debt by 1 minus the tax rate. You literally get a built-in discount just for borrowing money.
Section 4. The weighted average mix.
Okay, so now that we've isolated the cost of debt and the cost of equity, we enter the mixing bowl phase. We have to combine these costs based on their actual proportions within the firm. But listen, we have to follow a very strict rule from the source text here. These weights must be based on current market value, not historical book value. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't price today's cake recipe using the cost of a bag of flour from 1995, right? No way. You have to value a business based on what its debt and equity are actually trading for in the real market today.
Let's see how this all actually comes together in practice to estimate the overall costs of financing. We have a calculation straight from the source material to look at. Notice the numbers here. We've got a cost of equity at 10.28%. Then we have an after-tax cost of debt that is much, much lower, sitting at 3.90%. Now, by multiplying each of those by their market value proportions, In this case, it's 12.45% for the debt ratio and the rest for equity. They perfectly blend into a 9.49% total cost of capital. That right there is our WACC. That is the magic hurdle rate this specific company needs to clear.
Section 5. Avoiding valuation traps.
Now, it wouldn't be a proper explainer if I didn't warn you about the actual practical hurdles you're going to face when doing this. The formulas look incredibly clean, right? But reality throws us a curveball. Welcome to the circular trap. As the text points out, you need the cost of capital to estimate the value of the firm. But wait, to get your market value weights for the cost of capital, you need to already know the firm's value. It is literally a classic chicken and egg scenario. In practice, analysts overcome this maddening loop by iterating. They start with book values to get a baseline cost of capital, they use that to estimate a new firm value, and then they plug that new value back into the formula until the numbers finally stop moving around and converge. It takes a little spreadsheet magic for sure, but it actually works.
So all of this builds to a pretty massive, fascinating conclusion. We've established that debt is cheaper than equity, and it comes with this massive, beautiful tax shield. So if adding cheaper debt lowers the overall cost of capital, why don't companies just fund everything with 100% debt? It seems like a total financial cheat code, right? But the text reveals a terrifying reality: bankruptcy risk. As you push that debt higher and higher, the firm's default risk just skyrockets. That destroys its bond rating, which drives the cost of that debt straight through the roof, and eventually, that wipes out the equity entirely. The true art of corporate finance is finding that absolute perfect balance. So I'll leave you with this to ponder. At what exact point does the cheap cost of borrowed money transform into a lethal threat to a business? Keep that in the back of your mind the next time you look at a company's balance sheet. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.